Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's class. I want to talk about the Jesus brand simply because it's a concept that we can all wrap our minds around because simply we live in a world of brands. And whilst we talk about the Jesus brand, I in no ways want to be irreverent. I'm only using modern jargon, modern language in order for us to get closer to Jesus and to understand him more and better. So if you look at the picture that we sent out with this invitation to join this class tonight, you will notice that that particular picture of Jesus comes to us in a kind of a cultural package. And most of our ideas around Jesus, especially if we are visual people, we have a visual idea of who Jesus was. And there's obviously a great danger here because those pictures, those ideas often come to us through a culture. A lot of us are Caucasian people. We come from Europe. And a lot of the pictures and ideas that we have around Jesus come to us in that kind of package. If you look at the Renaissance, for example, Michelangelo, Leonardo, all these different people that gave us pictures like the Last Supper, for example. Our ideas of Jesus come to us in that kind of cultural package, a very formal setting of men sitting around a very formal table. With Jesus in the middle. We know the picture well, the picture of the Last Supper. So obviously that's not true, especially when it comes to the Bible, because Jesus says salvation is of the Jews. Jesus clearly was a Jew. The whole of Scripture comes to us through the Jewish cultural package, so to speak. And so a lot of those ideas are very erroneous. And so we need to try and unpack that. And we're going to use the concept of brands to do that. So when we come to looking at branding, brands go back at least 2,000 years before Jesus. They were purely used to depict ownership, for example, of cattle. You had different types of cattle, and to differentiate my cattle from your cattle, mine might be a dairy herd and yours might be a beef herd. To differentiate between those cattle, I would brand my cattle by using a branding iron. If you go back to a lot of the silversmiths and goldsmiths of the Dark Ages and just coming out of the Dark Ages, they would brand their particular goods to signify the origins of that particular knife, a fork, or a bowl, or whatever it was. So that would also fall under this category of branding, to make sure that we understand the origins of a particular object. And of course, in the world that we live today, we look at brands like Apple, Nike, Coca-Cola, Google, and of course the list is absolutely endless. And the whole idea about a brand, especially modern branding, is that the people might come and go, but the brand's last forever if it's a successful brand. The originators or the conceptualists behind a particular brand, they might be a long time dead, but the brand is still alive. So there's this interesting kind of concept that goes with the Tower of Babel. Let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad. And of course, the names that we surround ourselves with today are the gods of today, Apple and Nike and Coca-Cola and whatnot. So when we come to look at brands and how they exist in the marketplace and how they work in the marketplace, there are basically two pillars that we need to focus on. That's the ESP and the USP. USP stands for the unique selling proposition. What is the physical difference between this brand of washing powder and that? For example, you have cold water wash OMO and you have automatic OMO. There's a physical difference between this washing powder and that washing powder. And that's called your USP, unique selling proposition. But of course, the sale is not made there. The sale is made on a different platform altogether. It's on the ESP, your emotional selling proposition. So that's how we buy things. We buy things on emotions. You have your physical difference, but then it's the emotional side of our natures that actually complete the purchase. So when you come to looking at Jesus as a brand, when we look at the way the Bible portrays Jesus, that goes back to 4,000 years before he was born. Jesus is promised to us as the seed of the woman. This is the first concept of the virgin birth. A virgin shall conceive and bear a son. And this concept is developed through the Old Testament as Jesus becoming the promised Messiah of Israel. And that's basically the way we would understand Jesus in the Bible. And so understanding Jesus as a brand, it comes through Jewish thinking. Not through Gentile thinking, not through Europe, not through America, not through England, but it comes through Jewish. And Jesus himself said, salvation is of the Jews. Jesus was a Jew. And I think that's a cornerstone of where we're going with our study tonight. So when John introduces Jesus to us in the New Testament, he introduces Jesus to us as the Word made flesh. This is the Old Testament made flesh. Jesus says, not one jot or tittle shall disappear from the law until all things be fulfilled. Jesus says that as far as the law is concerned, every little detail of the law was absolutely perfect. The jot refers to the little yud, which is the smallest letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And the tittle refers to the little quiff or the serif, as the pen would leave the parchment. That little quiff over there is the tittle. So Jesus says, not one jot or tittle shall disappear from the law. And this is very, very important for us to wrap our heads around, that Jesus was the Word made flesh, the Old Testament made flesh. And so John also introduces Jesus as the Lamb of God that will take away the sin of the world. And in Revelation, the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. So this is the way God reveals his Son to us. God, who hath at sundry times and divers manners spake in times past unto our fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. That's the way we find it in the book of Hebrews. So when we look at Jesus as a brand, obviously a lot of the Jesus brand has come to us through Catholicism. And today, according to Wikipedia, there's approximately 1.35 billion Catholics in the world. And the word Catholic, as you know, means the international church. Then, of course, we've got Protestants, which are approximately 1 billion. So that's a lot of people. And if you add into that the Eastern Orthodoxy of well over 200 million adherents, we've got 2.6 billion people that have a notion of Jesus in this world. And as you well know, I mean, the population today is 8 billion people. That's a lot of people that have a notion of Jesus. But I say a lot of those notions come through pictures. They come through our culture, and that becomes problematic. You can add into this picture also 1.9 billion Muslims, because they also have a notion of Jesus as the second prophet after Muhammad, but they still have a notion of Jesus. So that's a lot of people that know about Jesus. And so when we come to looking at Jesus, we need to again look at the USP, the unique selling proposition, and the ESP, which is your emotional selling proposition. So the way I see it, and obviously this is just a personal view, and I'd love to open this up for discussion. If you look at the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they, in a sense, portray very much the physical differences between God and Jesus. They focus very much on Jesus as the Son of Man. And you will well know that Matthew 1 goes right through a lineage, starts off with a lineage showing the physiology of Jesus. The book of the generations of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And we've got 42 generations which are listed for us in Matthew chapter 1. And of course, Luke chapter 3, we've got 77 generations that go right back to Adam. Again, dealing with the physiology of Jesus. And when you come to Mark's Gospel, 16 miracles in 11 chapters. I mean, that's pretty amazing. Here's a man full of vigor, full of energy. And as you well know, the key word to Mark's Gospel is straightway. Immediately that Jesus did these things. And he's a man of action. Again, all this is focusing on Jesus as the Son of Man. It's very masculine in nature. And so when we look at the physical differences between the Father and the Son, obviously one is a father, the other is a son. God is immortal, God only hath immortality, and Jesus was mortal. He was flesh and blood. And John points out that if we do not accept that Jesus has come in the flesh, we are Antichrist. So it's very important for us to understand that. One is unseen. No one can see God and live. And yet Jesus was seen, that which we've seen, which we've heard. The word of life. So obviously Jesus was seen. Jesus says, my Father is greater than I. Not equal, but greater. So that's an important difference. On one occasion, somebody came to Jesus and said, good master. Jesus said, oh, don't say that. There's none good but God. Again, Jesus draws that difference. God obviously is the creator and sustainer of all things, because the whole concept of Judaism is monotheism, that we believe in one God. And God created the heavens and the earth and everything that is in them. And you'll find that in the book of Exodus, dealing with the Sabbath law in Exodus 20. And Jesus clearly is one of the created ones. He was made like us in all points. He was made, and so he is one of the created ones. Clearly, the way the Old Testament is written, and God is the architect, the planner, the one that has designed all things, and Jesus is part of the plan. In fact, with Craig and Matthew, they run that beautiful program. In fact, they're running it this month, God's Master Plan. And that gives absolute direction, beautiful direction on the difference between God the Father and his Son. And God being the architect and Jesus being part of the plan of salvation. Again, God is almighty, not partially mighty, but almighty. And Jesus is subject to that almightiness. He's subject to the Father. Even at the end of the millennium, in 1 Corinthians 15, it says, then the Son will still be subject unto the Father. And of course, in our readings in Genesis, just a couple of weeks ago, this relationship between Joseph and Pharaoh is a perfect pattern for us to follow, to understand the relationship between Jesus and his Father. So in the parable, in the history of Joseph, Pharaoh would represent God and Joseph would represent Jesus. And it's very, very plain to see the relationship. He says, only in the throne will you be subject to me. The whole land is before you. Every knee is going to bow to you. You have control over the whole land of Egypt. But in the throne you will be subject to me. And that's obviously the way Jesus understands it. He has to submit his will to his Father's will in Gethsemane. And again, God is spirit, and those that worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. And Jesus was flesh and blood. Obviously, he is now ascended to the Father, so that changes things quite a lot, because He now sits at the right hand of the Father, and he is the Spirit, often referred to in the book of Acts. So that basically is dealing with the USP, the unique selling proposition, the synoptic gospels. But when you come to John's gospel is very, very different. It's an open-ended gospel. It starts off with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the last verse in John's gospel is an endless, it's an open-ended gospel, because it says of all the things that Jesus did, if they were to be recorded, not all the libraries in the world would be able to contain them. Whereas if you look at the synoptic gospels, each of the synoptic gospels has a fixed beginning and a fixed end. First and last verses of each of those synoptic gospels. But when you come to John's gospel, it's very different. John's gospel is very much a feminine gospel. It's focusing on the Son of God. And if you look carefully through the pages of John, it's very much the woman's gospel. It's the gospel that focuses on woman. Chapter 2, for example, dealing with his mother. Chapter 4, the Samaritan woman, the woman at the well. Chapter 8 deals with the woman that is caught in adultery. Chapter 11 is dealing with Mary and Martha. Chapter 19 tells us about the 4 women that were at the foot of the cross as Jesus dies, together with only one man, which is John. All the rest of the disciples, as you know, had forsaken Jesus. They weren't anywhere to be seen. But the women were there. And that's the focus of John's gospel. It's very, very feminine. And of course, when we come to chapter 20, this relationship between Mary Magdalene and Jesus in the garden, that's just one of the most remarkable chapters that, for me, is very, very moving. And of course, in that particular case, she becomes the first apostle. She says, go and tell my disciples that I'm going to meet with them in Galilee. So she's the very first one to carry that message. And a very precious and beautiful message it was. And if the word apostle means one sent, then that's exactly what she was. She was the first apostle, and the men came afterwards. So I mean, this is real beautiful stuff. And so when we come to looking at John's gospel, John's going to talk about this intimate relationship between the Father and the Son. He says, I and my Father are one. And he's not talking about one in substance, clearly, because God is spirit, and at the time that Jesus says that, he is flesh and blood. So clearly when he says, I and my Father are one, he's talking about one in purpose. And of course he opens that up for us in John chapter 17, that beautiful prayer. I call it the Lord's Prayer, where Jesus is dealing with his relationship with the Father, with his disciples, and with us. And it really is a very, very beautiful chapter to read. Again, Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So what is Jesus talking about? He's talking about character. You know, we're talking about the character of God, and the character of Jesus, obviously identical. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. He was full of grace and truth, which is what God is. And that's the way God revealed himself to Moses back in Exodus 34, as you well know. And again, God is love. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. I mean, this is the agape gospel, and of course his epistles also resonate with us as far as agape is concerned. You know, I mean, as a man, I understand a lot about phileo, I understand a lot about eros, but in a sense, as a man, I have to learn a lot about agape, and I learned a lot about agape from the women in my life. They're the ones that teach me about agape, sacrificial love, getting up to the baby morning, noon, and night, sacrificing their lives, their very existence for the baby that was housed in them, that they contained for 40 weeks. As men, we watch, but for many of us, just don't comprehend and understand that connection between mother and child. And so as brethren and sisters, I think that we are quite well versed in the USP, this difference between God and Jesus, the physiology, the substance, the matter. But we have great difficulty when it comes to understanding the emotional connection with Jesus. I think sometimes we kind of paint ourselves into a corner, that we focus so much on Jesus being the Son of Man that he becomes merely a man, becomes just a brother, just a friend, just and we, in a sense, rob Jesus of his divinity. He's uniquely the Son of God. We're very comfortable talking to our angels. We're very comfortable talking to God, but we're not comfortable talking to Jesus. And why would that be? You are my friends if you do whatever I command you. And when we come to looking at those concepts of the Comforter in John 14 and John 16, he says, I'm going to be with you, even to the end of the age. And so he changes his relationship once he ascends up into heaven. He becomes the Spirit, he becomes the Comforter, he becomes the Holy Spirit, as we see in the epistles of John. I find this very, very beautiful and very rewarding to be able to talk about my relationship with Jesus. Some of us can't read Isaiah 52 and 53 without being moved to tears. In Judaism, this is known as the forbidden chapter. It's quite remarkable. I want to share with you some of these incredible words that we're going to read together from Isaiah. And so here it is in the middle of Jerusalem. You have a mountain called Mount Scopus, and on Mount Scopus you have the Shrine of the Book, which is where the Dead Sea Scrolls are housed, and right in the center of the Shrine of the Book, you've got the great scroll of Isaiah, dating back 200 BC, before Jesus was born. And right in the middle of that incredible scroll, we find Isaiah 53. And it's known as the forbidden chapter because any Jewish person reading that chapter with eyes to see and ears to hear will know that is talking about Jesus. So we're going to pick it up in Isaiah 52 and verse 13. Behold, my servant shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled and be very high. And just look at these words in verse 14. Just as many were astonished at you, so his visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. The New International Version says that his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form was marred beyond human likeness. And so as we come to the next chapter, we see that he has no form or comeliness that we should desire him. There's no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. The sight was so terrible, so ghastly, that we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne our griefs, and when I read these words, I often try to personalize them. Surely he has borne my griefs. He has carried my sorrows. Yet I esteemed him stricken and smitten of God and afflicted. These are very moving words. He was wounded for my transgressions. He was bruised for my iniquities. The chastisement of my peace was upon him, and by his stripes I am healed. Before I knew Jesus, I used to blaspheme his name. Before I knew Jesus, I used to tell religious jokes for which I'm ashamed. I was like a sheep that had gone astray. Isaiah continues that I had turned away. Every one of us, in one sense or another, has turned away to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, he was afflicted, and he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearers is silent. He didn't open his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment. And who will declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was stricken. And they made his grave with the wicked. Remember that he was crucified with two malefactors. But with the rich in his death, he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, that cold tomb, the tomb of a rich man. Because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth, yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. I struggle with those words. I really struggle with those words. And God put him to grief. When you make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed and prolong his days. And the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. And he shall see the labor of his soul and be satisfied. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross and despised the shame, and is now set down at the right hand of the Father on high. Oh, the author and finisher of faith. What a beautiful, beautiful verse in Hebrews. He shall see the labor of his soul and be satisfied. By his knowledge my righteous servant shall be justified. He shall see the labor of his soul and be justified. By his knowledge my righteous servant shall justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore, the prophet says, I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he has poured out his soul unto death. He was numbered with the transgressors, and he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for transgressors, of whom I am the chief. I've transgressed in so many ways, but now I thank God through Jesus that I'm washed, I'm clean, not through my righteousness, not through anything that I do, but through Jesus, the King, my Savior, my Lord. And so, my dear brothers and sisters for whom Christ died, I pray that you found this class helpful, and that when you look at Jesus as a brand, that brand becomes very personal, and that it doesn't fall into the category of what other people think, because it's about your relationship with Jesus. It's about my relationship with Jesus, and that's vital. You'll remember on one occasion, it was at Caesarea Philippi, that Jesus challenged his disciples with these words, whom do men say that I am? And the disciples said, well, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're Elijah, some say you're a prophet, some say this, some say that. But Jesus says, who do you say that I am? And you remember that Peter said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. He that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches.